The wagon came in from the east, just as the sun cracked open over the ridge, spilling pale gold light across the frost-stiffened grass. Cade Harlow heard it long before he saw it. The slow creak of iron wheels, the muffled knock of hooves on the dry trail. And he did not look up from the fence post he was driving into the ground. The mallet came down once, twice, a third time, clean and final. He moved to the next post. The wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of the yard. He heard the driver call out, heard the creak of the stepboard, heard boots touch the ground. Light boots, deliberate, not hesitant, not hurried, just purposeful, the way a person moves when they have already decided where they are going. Cade drove the next post without turning around. He had known this morning would come. His brother Colt had arranged it in the last weeks before he passed, quietly and without asking permission, the way Colt had always done things he believed were necessary. The letter from the placement agency had arrived 2 months after the funeral, addressed to Cade in handwriting that was not Colt's, explaining that a woman had been selected, that she would arrive before the first frost, that all had been arranged per the instructions of one Colt Harlow, who had signed and paid in full before his passing. Cade had read the letter twice, folded it, and set it on the kitchen table where it stayed for 11 days before he moved it to the drawer. He had not written back to stop it. He told himself it was because Colt had already paid. He told himself it was because there was no clean way to undo a dead man's plans. He did not let himself think too long about the other reason, the one that lived underneath those reasons like water under frozen ground. The fact that Tobias had not laughed since April, and that the house had begun to feel less like a place people lived, and more like a place they waited. The mallet came down again. Behind him, the yard stayed quiet. He heard the wagon driver say something low, heard the jangle of reins as he turned the horse around, heard the slow pull of wheels retreating back down the trail toward town. The woman had been left. He kept working. It was another 10 minutes before he heard the small sound that made him finally set the mallet down. Not a voice, not a step, not anything he could have named precisely. Just a shift in the quality of the silence behind him, the way silence changes when it is being shared. He turned around. She was standing at the edge of the porch, not on it, but just at the foot of the steps. One hand holding a worn leather bag and the other resting on top of a wooden box, the kind with hinged latches and a small iron lock. She was not looking at the house the way most people looked at it, as though measuring it against some expectation. She was looking at it the way a person looks at a task they are trying to understand before they begin. She was not what he had pictured. He was not sure what he had pictured. Her coat was plain and well worn at the elbows, dark wool the color of river mud, and her hair was pulled back simply, a few strands loose around her face from the ride. She was not young in the way that made people nervous, not old in the way that made them stop looking. She was somewhere in the between of it, the kind of age that belongs to a person who has done real work and knows what it costs. She turned her head and saw him standing at the fence line, mallet in hand, and she did not smile, did not wave, did not call out. She only looked at him with a directness that was not rude, but was not soft either. The look of someone who had learned a long time ago that pretending not to see a thing was a waste of everybody's time. Cade became aware that he was still holding the mallet. He set it down against the fence post and walked toward the house. The boy was already there. Tobias had appeared on the porch at some point without Cade noticing, which was the way of him, quiet and sudden as a cat, standing 2 steps up with a book held against his chest and his dark eyes moving slowly between the stranger and his father. He was 9 years old and small for it, with his mother's coloring and his Uncle Colt's habit of watching everything carefully before deciding what to think of it. He had not spoken to the woman yet. He was not hiding from her either. He was simply present, waiting. The woman looked at him. She looked at the book. "Is that any good?" she asked. Tobias considered her for a moment. "It's about horses," he said. "Does it have pictures?" "Some." She nodded as though this was a satisfactory answer and did not push further. She did not try to smile at him in the way adults sometimes did when they wanted children to like them immediately. That bright, slightly desperate smile that children always saw through. She simply accepted his answer and let him keep his distance, and Cade watched his son's shoulders drop a fraction of an inch, the way they did when something stopped feeling like a threat. Cade reached the porch steps. Up close, she was tired in the way that travel makes a person tired, not beaten, just worn at the edges. There was a small mark on her jaw, the faded remnant of something, a bruise perhaps, though it was old enough that it could have been many things. And her hands, when they shifted her bag, were not soft hands. They were hands that knew how to work. "Nora Vess," she said. "Cade Harlow." He did not offer his hand. Neither did she. They stood looking at each other in the cool morning air with the kind of honesty that comes from both people knowing they are in an unusual situation and choosing not to pretend otherwise. "You can put your things inside," he said. "Tobias will show you the room." She nodded. She moved toward the steps without waiting for anything more, and as she passed him, he noticed the wooden box. It was heavier than it looked. He could tell from the way she carried it, balanced rather than gripped, the way you carry something you don't want to set down roughly. "What's in the box?" he asked, and did not know why. She paused on the second step and looked back at him. "Tools," she said. He thought she meant cooking tools, or sewing tools, or some other domestic collection. He did not ask further. He picked up his mallet and went back to the fence. The room Colt had told the agency to mention was at the back of the house, the one that caught afternoon light through a window facing the hills. Reeve had used it as a sewing room in the early years, before Tobias was born, before the ranch had grown enough to take all the hours of all the days. After she passed, Cade had closed the door and not opened it again, except to set things inside that he did not know what else to do with. 3 weeks before the woman was due to arrive, he had gone in and carried those things out and put a cot in the corner with a wool blanket and a pillow, and that was all he had done to prepare. He had not thought about whether it was enough. He had stood in the doorway for a long time before he left. The room smelled of old fabric and cold air and something faintly sweet that he could not name, could not place, but that sat in his chest like a hand pressing down. He had looked at the bare nail on the wall where a small mirror had hung for years, and at the single chair beside the window, and at the way the afternoon light fell across the floor in a long, narrow stripe. And he had thought about how a room could hold the shape of a person long after the person was gone, the way water holds the shape of a stone after the stone has been lifted out. He had closed the door and not gone back. Nora Vess stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room. It was plain. The walls were bare except for a single nail where something had once hung and been taken down. The floor was wood, scrubbed but not polished. The window needed washing. The cot was narrow. She set her bag on the floor and the wooden box on the small table near the window, and she began to unpack without commentary. Tobias had followed her to the doorway without quite meaning to, pulled along by the same quiet attention he gave to anything that moved through his world in an unexpected way. He watched her shake out a folded blanket from her bag, a worn thing in faded blue that she spread over the wool blanket already on the cot without replacing it, adding warmth rather than substituting it. "You can come in if you want," she said, without looking at him. He came in and sat on the floor near the window, still holding his book, and watched her move around the small room with the efficient unhurry of someone who had learned how to settle into unfamiliar spaces without needing them to be anything other than what they were. "Do you read much?" she asked him. "When Pa lets me stay up." "Does he let you often?" Tobias thought about this honestly. He forgets sometimes when he's tired. She set a small tin on the windowsill, the kind with a lid, plain and unmarked. She did not explain what it was. "Is he tired a lot?" she asked, and the question was quiet. The way a person asks something when they already suspect the answer but want to give the other person the chance to say it themselves. Tobias looked at the floor. "He works a lot," he said, which was true, and also not quite the whole truth. And somehow she seemed to understand both things at once, because she only said, "I see," and did not ask him anything more about it. The evening came down fast, the way it did in that country when the season was turning, light going from gold to copper to gray in the span of a breath. And then the cold settled in like something that had been waiting just beyond the hills for permission to arrive. Cade came in as the sky went dark. He stamped his boots at the door and hung his coat on the peg in the entry and stood for a moment in the doorway between the entry and the kitchen, taking stock of the room. There was something on the stove. There were 3 plates on the table. Tobias was already sitting in his chair, still holding the book but not reading it, watching the stove where Nora Vess moved with the competent stillness of someone who had cooked in difficult places and considered this kitchen quite manageable by comparison. Cade looked at the 3 plates for a moment longer than he meant to. He sat down. Nora brought the pot to the table and served without ceremony, ladled out portions, and set the pot back on the iron rest, and then sat in the 3rd chair, the one that had not been sat in regularly for a long time, and no one said anything about that. Tobias picked up his fork. Cade picked up his fork. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, and the fire in the stove crackled once and settled. They ate. It was a simple meal, nothing that required comment, and that in itself was its own kind of mercy. The food was good in the way that straightforward things are good when they have been prepared with attention. The bread was warm, and the broth was seasoned properly, and there was enough of it. Cade noticed these things with the peripheral awareness of a man who has been eating whatever was available for long enough that the presence of actual cooking registered as something different, something that belonged to a version of the house he had almost forgotten. After the dishes were done, after Tobias had been sent to bed and had gone without the argument he sometimes gave, Cade sat at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm and looked at the woman across from him who was turning the pages of a small notebook, making notations in handwriting too small to read at this distance. He had been thinking, throughout dinner, about what he needed to say. He had been working out the words the way he worked out a plan for a difficult section of fence, practically, without sentiment, looking for the clearest line between 2 points. "I need you to understand something," he said. She looked up. She set her pen down. "I agreed to this because Colt asked me to," he said. Before he passed, he worried about Tobias. He thought the boy needed someone here. He paused. "I'm not going to pretend that's not true, because it is. But I want to be straight with you about what I can offer and what I can't." She was watching him with that same direct attention he had noticed that morning, not impatient, not nervous, just present. "You'll have the room," he said. "You'll have meals and a wage for whatever work you do in the house. I'll treat you fairly, but I'm not." He stopped, picked up his coffee, set it back down. "I've got nothing left over to give past that. I want you to know that going in." The fire cracked in the stove. The wind moved outside. "Is Tobias's supper always that late?" she asked. He looked at her. "It was past 8 when we sat down," she said. Not accusing, not sharp. Just the observation of someone who had assessed a situation and identified the most immediate fact. Cade opened his mouth and then did not say anything, because the truth was that he had not noticed. The truth was that he had come in from the fields when he came in from the fields, and the kitchen had been empty, and Tobias had learned to wait, and had been that way for long enough that Cade had stopped seeing it as a problem and started seeing it as the shape of their days. He had not noticed. "The boy should eat at 6, Nora said. "If you're going to be out late, I'll need to know so I can plan for it." It was such a practical thing to say. It was so far from what he had braced himself for, from tears or demands or declarations, that he felt something in his chest go briefly sideways, a gear slipping, clicking back into place. "Fine," he said. She picked up her pen and made a small mark in the notebook. The matter, apparently, was settled. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Nora Vess sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the back room and looked at the wooden box on the table by the window. She opened it. Inside, arranged with the practiced neatness of someone who had learned that disorder in a difficult moment cost time that people sometimes did not have, were her tools, rolled bandaging, a set of small steel instruments wrapped in cloth, 2 tins of salve, 1 for burns, and 1 for infection. A glass bottle of something amber-colored, stoppered with a cork. A bone-handled knife for cutting, sharp enough to do what needed to be done. A folded square of leather she used as a working surface when no table was available. She checked each item in the particular way she always checked them when she arrived somewhere new, not because she feared anything was missing, but because the ritual of it steadied her, reminded her who she was when the surroundings were still unfamiliar. She had done this in a dozen different places over the years, in different rooms that smelled of different things, and the box had always been the constant, the thing that did not change with geography or circumstance. She had not always traveled with all of it. There had been a time when she worked in a proper room with proper supplies and other people around who knew their jobs and did them. That time had ended the way some chapters end, not with a door slamming, but with a door being quietly locked from the other side, and she had found herself standing in a hallway with the understanding that the person she had trusted most had used everything she told him and left her with nothing she could prove. She had packed her tools and gone. She had been good at the work. She knew that much. She had always been good at looking at a situation clearly, at finding what was most wrong and addressing it first and working from there. It was not a gentle talent, not the kind people celebrated in a woman, but it was hers, and she had never been able to make herself smaller for the sake of it. Below the tools, at the very bottom of the box, there was an envelope. It had arrived the same week she left, forwarded through the placement agency, addressed in a hand she did not recognize, her name on the front, a return notation she had not looked at closely. She had put it in the box with a vague sense that she would open it when she arrived, when the journey was done, when she was somewhere she could sit still long enough to read it properly. She picked it up now. The name on the return was Cade Harlow. She turned the envelope over in her hands. The man was gone. She had known that from the agency, had known she was coming to a household already shaped by absence, had thought she understood what that meant. But this was different. This was a letter written by that absence, by the hands that had set this particular arrangement in motion, addressed to her specifically, sent before he could know whether she would come or go. She set it on the table beside the box. Not yet. The window showed her nothing but dark and a faint wash of stars above the ridge, and the house around her made the small sounds that houses make when they are settling into cold. The creak of timber, the tick of a cooling stove, the hush of wind finding the gaps, and below all of that, just barely audible, something else. She rose from the cot and went to the window and looked out into the yard. He was there. Cade Harlow was standing in the dark in the center of the yard, not moving toward anything, not coming from anywhere, just standing the way a man stands when he has forgotten how to be inside but has not thought of anywhere to go instead. His coat was on, his hands at his sides, and he was looking out toward the dark shape of the hills with a stillness that did not belong to a person who was resting, but to a person who is enduring. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She had seen this before. Not this man, not this yard, but this particular stillness. She had seen it in people who had taken on more than a body was built to carry, and had been carrying it so long they could no longer feel the weight, only the exhaustion of the carrying. She had seen it in people who had lost someone and did not know how to live inside the house where they had lost them, and so they stood outside in the cold instead, because at least the cold was honest about what it was. She understood this. She did not pity it. She let the curtain fall. She went back to the cot and sat down and looked at the envelope on the table, and she did not open it, and she did not put it away. She turned out the lamp. In the dark, with the wind outside and the house settling around her, and somewhere in the yard, a man standing alone in the cold, she made no decisions and no promises. She only sat with the understanding that she had come to a place that was in some kind of trouble she could not yet name, and that naming it would take time, and that she was, at the very least, not afraid of what she did not yet know. That was enough for tonight. That would have to be enough. The frost came harder in the second week, arriving each night with more intention than the last, and by morning it had silvered the grass and stiffened the mud at the edges of the yard into something that held the impression of boots until midday. Nora noticed these things. She noticed most things, had trained herself years ago to read the physical world the way other people read text, quickly and without drama, extracting what was useful and moving on. What she noticed most in those early days was the shape of the household silences. The silence at breakfast when Cade ate standing at the counter rather than sitting at the table was the silence of a man who had stopped expecting meals to be a shared thing and had never revised that expectation. The silence in the afternoon when Tobias came in from his lessons and sat in the chair by the window with his book was lonelier. The silence of a child who had learned to be quiet because quiet was what the house asked of him. And the silence in the evenings, after supper, was the thickest kind, the kind that had been accumulating for long enough that it had weight, that it pressed against the walls and made the lamp seem dimmer than it was. Nora did not try to fill these silences. She had seen what happened when people tried to fill grief with noise. It never worked. It only made the grief louder by contrast when the noise stopped. She cooked. She cleaned. She organized the kitchen with a practical efficiency that made everything slightly easier to find. And she did not mention that she had done it. She moved the flour to a shelf that could be reached without climbing, put the salt and the smaller spices within easy reach of the stove, arranged the pots by size in a way that made sense for the actual sequence of how meals were prepared. Small changes that would not be noticed consciously, but that would, over time, make the daily work of the house slightly less effortful. She had learned that this was how you changed a household, not by announcing a new order, but by removing the friction from the old one. She brought Tobias through his morning lessons with the same even attention she gave to everything, not effusive, not impatient, answering his questions directly and asking him questions in return that required him to think rather than recite. She could see him beginning to relax into this rhythm, the small daily evidence of a child who had not known he was starving for consistent attention until someone had started providing it. She watched Cade from the careful distance she maintained in those first weeks, and she saw the exhaustion in him the way she saw it in the landscape, not as a single dramatic thing, but as an accumulation. The deep tiredness of a man who had been running a large and demanding operation on sheer habit and stubbornness, while some essential part of himself had gone quiet and was no longer contributing to the effort. She did not say any of this to him. On the fifth morning, she went to the barn before breakfast. She had heard one of the horses moving uneasily in the night, a sound just distinct enough from the usual barn noises to register in her sleep and pull her back to wakefulness. She had lain still and listened, and then decided she would look in the morning, and she had not mentioned it because there was nothing to mention yet, only a sound and an intention. The horse was in the second stall, a dark bay with a white mark on its nose, and it was favoring its left rear leg in the way horses do when something has been bothering them long enough that they have adjusted their whole posture around it, shifting their weight with the small automatic corrections of a body compensating for pain. Cade used a different horse most days. She had noticed this, had wondered at it, and now she understood. He had either noticed the problem and had no time to address it, or he had stopped seeing it the way people stopped seeing things that had been true for too long. She moved slowly into the stall, speaking quietly, and the horse allowed her to examine the leg without much argument. The tendon was tight, but not torn. The fetlock warm to the touch, but not swollen in any alarming way. There was an old wrap still on the lower leg, dried out and doing less good than nothing. She went back to the house for her box. She worked for half an hour in the early morning cold, unwrapping and cleaning and applying a draw poultice from one of her tins, and rewrapping the leg with clean bandaging in the pattern she had learned from a horse doctor years ago, tight enough to support and loose enough not to restrict. The horse stood for it with the dignified patience of an animal that recognizes competent handling. She was finishing the last wrap when she heard steps in the barn doorway. Cade stood there with his coat half buttoned and his coffee still in his hand, and he looked at her kneeling in the stall with her tin open beside her and his horse standing calm under her hands, and he did not say anything for a moment. "Tendon," she said without looking up. "Old strain, not rested properly. He'll need to stay off it another week at least." Cade looked at the leg. He looked at the horse's face. Something moved across his expression that she did not try to name. "I used the bay last season," he said finally. "He was fine then." "He's been compensating for a while," she said. "Sometimes they hide it well until they can't." She closed the tin and stood and gathered her things, and Cade stepped aside to let her out of the stall, and that was all that was said about it. But that afternoon, when she looked out the kitchen window in the direction of the barn, she saw that Cade had come back to it in the middle of the day, which she had not seen him do before. He stood outside the stall for a few minutes, looking in at the horse, his hands resting on the top rail of the door. And then he went back to the fields. He came home that evening an hour earlier than the nights before. He did not mention the horse. He did not say that her finding it had mattered. He simply came in earlier and sat at the table for supper rather than eating standing at the counter. And she set his plate in front of him, and Tobias's in front of Tobias, and her own in front of her. And they ate in the same essential quiet as always, except that the quality of it had shifted slightly in a direction she did not try to measure. Tobias began talking more in the second week, not to Cade, not yet, but to Nora, in the way children talk when they have decided, without quite deciding, that a person is safe enough to think out loud around. He talked about the horses by name and described their personalities with the serious thoroughness of an expert. He talked about his book and summarized its chapters in great detail, occasionally forgetting he was summarizing and simply reading aloud. And she let him do this without redirecting him, because she could see that reading aloud was something he had done before, with someone, and that the muscle memory of it was still there, looking for an outlet. One afternoon, when the wind was too cold for outdoor work and he had finished his lessons and she was putting up a simple supper, he said from his chair by the window, "Pa never used to sleep out there." She did not turn from the stove. Out where? In the barn. At night. He said it with the careful flatness of a child reporting something he has observed and filed away without knowing what to do with. I see the lamp sometimes when I wake up. He doesn't know I see it. She kept her hands moving, turning the bread she had set in the pan. How long has he been doing that? Tobias thought about it with genuine effort. Since before my last birthday, he said. Maybe before that. She added wood to the stove and did not say anything for a moment. The fire caught and settled. Is he sad? Tobias asked. It was a child's question, direct in the way children are direct when they have been sitting with something long enough that the politeness of not asking has used itself up. I think he's carrying something heavy, she said, and he's been carrying it alone for a long time. Tobias looked at the window. Outside, the yard was pale and empty in the cold afternoon light. Uncle Colt used to help him, he said. Before. I know, she said, though she only knew it in the way you know a shape from its outline, not from its substance. Tobias was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think you can help him? She turned and looked at him then, the small, serious boy with his book and his careful eyes, and she answered him honestly, because she had found that honesty was the only thing children respected when it came to the things that mattered. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm not leaving. He looked at her for a long time, with the assessing gaze that reminded her so strongly of what she imagined Colt Harlow must have been like, that it caught her for a moment in the chest. Then he nodded and went back to his book, and that, apparently, was sufficient. The man who arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon came in a good coat and on a good horse, and carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to having space made for him. He rode into the yard without calling ahead, and tied his horse at the post near the porch and knocked on the door while Cade was still out on the far pasture, and Tobias was in the barn with the recuperating horse. Nora opened the door. He was older than Cade by perhaps 15 years, square-faced and heavy through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and small eyes that moved around the visible interior of the house before they settled on her. He smiled with his mouth. His eyes continued their inventory. Rennick Galt, he said. I'm a neighbor. Ride the land south of here. Came to pay my respects to Cade. He's out in the fields, she said. You're welcome to wait. He came in without needing a second invitation and sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee she poured with the ease of a man who expected to be accommodated and generally was. He looked around the kitchen with an interest that was slightly too thorough to be casual. "You'd be the woman Colt arranged," he said. "I'd be Nora Vess," she said, and she set the coffee pot back on the stove and turned to face him. Something in her tone or her posture made him recalibrate slightly. He set his cup down and looked at her with more attention and less performance. "I was close with Colt," he said. "We went back a long way. His passing was a hard thing. I'm sure it was. Cade took it badly." He said this in the tone of a man offering useful information to an outsider, a tone that implied he possessed context she did not. "He's been struggling. The ranch has been struggling. I've tried to help where I can, but a proud man doesn't accept help easily." "Most people don't," she said. He glanced at her with the small irritation of a man who was used to being agreed with. "I want you to understand," he said, settling forward with a new and more confidential weight, "that I have Cade's best interests at heart. Whatever he's told you about his situation here, the reality of it is more complicated. This ranch has been under pressure since before Colt died, and without Colt's management." He stopped and made a slight gesture that implied the rest was obvious. "What kind of pressure?" she asked. He leaned back slightly, as though she had asked something more pointed than he expected. "The financial kind," he said. "The kind that catches up with a man who's been too deep in grief to pay proper attention." She looked at him. He held her gaze with the practiced ease of someone who had looked at people across many negotiating tables. "You've been very kind to come by," she said. "I'll tell Cade you were here." He stayed another 20 minutes, talking about the land and the season and the general difficulties of ranching in this country, and she listened and responded just enough to be civil and gave him nothing. When Cade's horse finally appeared at the far edge of the yard, Rennick Galt stood and collected his coat and was standing on the porch by the time Cade rode up, which positioned the meeting as a coincidence of timing rather than a patient wait. She watched from the kitchen window. The two men spoke for several minutes. Cade's posture was not unfriendly, but it was careful, the posture of a man who was neither comfortable nor ready to show discomfort. Rennick did most of the talking, gesturing once toward the house in a way that could have meant anything. After Galt rode out, Cade came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. There was a question in his face that he was not sure how to ask. "He told me the ranch has been under financial pressure," she said. He said it with a great deal of sympathy. Cade's jaw shifted slightly. "He's a neighbor," he said. "He's been—" He stopped. "Helpful?" she offered. He did not answer that. He poured himself coffee and stood with it looking out the window at the empty yard where Galt's horse had stood. "How long was he here?" "About half an hour," she said. He was very interested in the kitchen. Something in the way she said it made Cade look at her again, and she returned the look steadily, and after a moment, he almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there and gone like a coin dropped in deep water, visible for only a moment before it sank. But it was the first one she had seen from him, and she noted it and said nothing about it. It was the ledger books that showed her what she had already begun to suspect. She had found them when she was reorganizing the kitchen shelf where they had been stacked beneath a collection of other papers, their spines unmarked, their pages dense with Colt's small, precise handwriting in the earlier entries, and Cade's larger, less consistent hand in the later ones. She had not asked to look at them. She had simply found them in the course of moving things, and she had opened the first one to understand what she was looking at. And once she understood, she could not look away. The accounts were not fraudulent. They were not even, strictly speaking, inaccurate. They were simply incomplete in the way that things become incomplete when the person maintaining them has been spending the better part of their energy on not falling apart, filling in numbers when they could, and leaving gaps when they couldn't, and not going back to reconcile the gaps. Because going back meant looking at the dates, and some dates were harder than others to look at. There were entries missing from the months just after Reeves' death, a blank stretch of nearly 3 months during which the ranch had apparently operated on pure muscle memory. Cade had restarted the ledger in the spring, but several accounts had drifted in the interval, and what should have been a clear picture of the ranch's position was instead a landscape in partial fog, most of it visible, parts of it obscured. She sat with the books for 2 evenings, after Tobias was in bed and Cade had gone to the barn, and she worked through them the way she worked through a medical situation, methodically, without panic, looking for what was true rather than what she feared. By the end of the second evening, she had a reasonable picture of where things stood. The ranch was not ruined. It was not even close to ruined. But there was a specific pressure point, a detail buried in a supplementary agreement that Colt had signed in the difficult months before his death. An agreement involving a portion of the eastern pasture and a sum of money that had been useful at the time and was now, with accumulated interest and an impatient creditor, becoming something more complicated than a simple debt. She folded her notes into the back of the most recent ledger and put the books back where she had found them. The next morning, she asked Cade, during the small window between breakfast and his departure for the day's work, whether she might take over the daily account entries. She said it plainly, without preamble, explaining that she had noticed the books on the shelf and had some experience with accounts from her years at the medical station. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the slight narrowing of attention that meant he was seeing her more clearly than usual. "You have experience with accounts," he said. It was not quite a question. "I was the only person at the station who could be trusted to do them correctly," she said. Which is not the same as having been trained in it, but the results were the same. He looked at the shelf, then he looked at his coffee. Then he said, "Fine," and went out to the yard. She opened the ledger that evening and began. He found her at it that night when he came in late, the lamp on the table throwing its circle of warmth over the pages she was working through, her pen moving steadily, her notes arranged in a clean column beside the main entry. He stopped in the doorway for a moment, and she did not look up. And he went quietly to the stove and poured himself water from the kettle and stood drinking it at the counter. "Rennick Galt has been coming by more often this year," he said. She continued writing. "I noticed. He's not a bad man," Cade said. It sounded like something he said to himself regularly, a small maintenance of fairness towards someone he did not entirely trust. "I didn't say he was." A pause. The fire cracked. "He wants the east pasture," Cade said. "He's wanted it since before Colt was sick. There's water on it. Better water than anything he has on his own land." She set her pen down and looked at him. He was still looking at the counter. "And there's an agreement," she said, "attached to the deed for that parcel. Colt signed it." He looked at her then. His face was still, but she had learned to read what lived below the stillness. And what lived there now was the particular tightness of a man who had known something for a long time, and had been managing the knowledge by not looking at it directly. "You found the ledgers," he said. "They were on the shelf," she said. "I didn't read anything I didn't need to read." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up again, pushing against the side of the house with a sound like a held breath being slowly released. Tobias was long since asleep. The house was down to its bones, just the two of them and the lamp and the ledger between them. The agreement was supposed to give Colt time, he said. He needed money for his treatment. Rennick offered good terms. He paused. They seemed like good terms. They were good terms, she said, until someone decided to read a certain clause in a certain way. He looked at her. I'll need to keep going through the books, she said. But I think there's more room than it looks like. I want to see the whole picture before I say anything else. He stood there for another moment, and she could see him weighing something, some old and practiced resistance against receiving help, and she did not press him and did not soften her gaze and did not do anything except wait, because she had learned that some things could not be hurried. All right, he said. He set his cup in the basin. He moved toward the back of the house. He stopped in the doorway. The bay horse, he said. He was moving better today. He should be, she said. Another week, and you can work him again. He nodded. He went to bed. She turned back to the ledger and kept working, and the lamp burned steady and warm, and outside the frost was already forming again on the grass and the fence posts and the long, dark slant of the hills. But inside the house, something was different than it had been. Some almost imperceptible shift in the temperature of things. So small you could have missed it entirely if you were not the kind of person who paid attention to what the air in a room was doing. Nora Vess was exactly that kind of person. She made a note in the margin, capped her pen, and read it back to confirm it was right. It was right. She moved to the next page. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was not yet comfortable, but was no longer strange. Nora learned the house the way she learned most things, by paying attention without announcing that she was doing so. She learned that the third step on the stairs had a particular voice, and that Cade always paused on it in the dark when he came in late, the way a person pauses at the threshold of something without knowing why. She learned that Tobias kept a small collection of smooth stones on the windowsill of his room, arranged in a row of descending size, and that he added to them occasionally, bringing one in from the yard with the solemn deliberateness of someone curating something that mattered. She learned that the kitchen smelled of pine resin in the mornings because of the wood stacked beside the stove, and that this smell, combined with the coffee she had started making earlier and stronger than whatever Cade had been making for himself, was beginning to feel like the smell of the house itself, like something native to it rather than brought in from outside. She also learned in those second and third weeks a few things about Cade Harlow that he did not know he was telling her. He was a man who fixed things before they broke, who noticed when a hinge was starting to wear and addressed it before anyone else would have seen the problem. He kept his tools in precise order, which was the habit of someone who had been responsible for everything alone for long enough that disorganization had become a luxury he could not afford. He fed the barn cats before he fed himself in the morning, which was something she noticed the second week when she came out early and found him with a tin dish at the barn door, the cats winding around his boots, and he had not seen her there. And so she had the rare experience of seeing him entirely unguarded, a large man in the cold morning air being gentle with small animals, which told her more about him than any conversation had yet managed. He did not talk about himself. She had noticed this in the first days and had filed it without judgment. Some people carried their interior lives very close, and in her experience, the depth of what was inside bore no relationship to the willingness to speak of it. What he did instead was work, and the quality of his work was its own kind of testimony. The fence posts he drove were exactly level. The stalls in the barn were kept with a fastidiousness that went beyond mere practicality. Even the kitchen garden, which he clearly did not tend with the same attention he gave to the ranch's commercial functions, had been laid out with a care for proportion that suggested he had once cared about it very much. She tended it now, and she did not say anything about this, and neither did he. But she noticed that he changed his route back to the house in the evenings to pass by it, which he had not done when she first arrived. The letter stayed on the table by the window for 11 days. Nora moved around it the way you move around something you are not ready for, giving it space without giving it distance, keeping it in the edge of her vision without letting it become the center. She had developed this habit long ago, with difficult things, not avoidance, which she had never had much patience for, but a kind of deliberate patience, the understanding that some things revealed themselves better when you did not force them open. On the 12th morning, she opened it. She sat on the edge of the cot in the early gray light before the house woke, and she unfolded the single page inside, and she read it. Cade Harlow's handwriting was smaller than his brother's, more controlled, the handwriting of a man who thought carefully before committing anything to permanence. The letter was not long. It did not attempt to be more than it was, which was the last honest effort of a man who knew he was running out of time. He wrote that he did not know her. He wanted to be clear about that. He had selected her name from the agency's correspondence, not because of anything she had said about herself, but because of one line she had written when asked to describe what she was looking for. She had written that she was not afraid of difficulty, only of dishonesty. He had read that line and put her letter aside and come back to it 3 times before he made his decision. He wrote that his brother was the best man he had ever known, and also one of the most thoroughly stuck, the way a good horse can be good and still refuse a particular gait for reasons that have nothing to do with the gait itself and everything to do with something that happened a long time ago on a different road. He wrote that Cade had been refusing his own life for nearly 4 years, and that no one who loved him had been able to reach him because the people who loved him were all tangled up in the same grief, and grief could not pull grief out of deep water. He wrote that he hoped she would find whatever she was looking for. He wrote that he thought Cade might need someone whose first instinct, when she saw a wound, was not to look away. He wrote, "I am sorry I won't be there to see how it turns out. I think it turns out well." Nora folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment, looking at the window where the light was beginning to come in pale and thin across the sill. Then she put it back in the envelope and set it at the bottom of the wooden box, beneath the tools, where it would be safe. She got up and went to make breakfast. She told him about it that evening, not all of it. She told him the shape of it, that Colt had written to her before she arrived, that she had been waiting to read it, until she felt she understood enough of the situation to understand what his brother had been trying to say. She told him that Colt had chosen her for a specific reason, and she told him what that reason was. Cade sat across the table and listened without moving. Tobias had gone to bed an hour ago, and the house was quiet, and the lamp was low. And she had the sense as she spoke that the room had gotten smaller without changing size, that the space between them had compressed until every word she said landed without the usual cushion of distance around it. When she finished, he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "He never told me he was writing to anyone. I don't think he wanted to give you the chance to talk him out of it." Something almost like a laugh crossed his face, there and gone quickly, the involuntary reflex of a person who recognizes someone they love accurately described. He looked at the table, he turned his coffee cup a quarter turn, and then back. "That's Colt," he said, and the two words carried the whole weight of a long and specific grief, the kind that belongs to brothers, to the particular closeness of people who grew up in the same hard place and came out different and never stopped understanding each other anyway. Nora waited. "He worried too much," Cade said. "He always thought things were worse than they were." She did not agree with this, and she did not argue with it. She let it sit. After a while, he said quietly, almost to himself, "Or he was right, and I just didn't want to hear it." She looked at him. He was still looking at the table, at the coffee cup, at the small circle of lamplight on the wood grain. He had the expression of a man who has just said something true, out loud for the first time, and is sitting with the strange weight of having done so. "He wrote that you were the best man he'd ever known," she said. Cade did not respond to this, but the line of his shoulders changed, just slightly, the way a held thing shifts when it has been seen. The morning she found him teaching Tobias to ride was one she had not expected. She had stepped out to the garden to assess what was left worth harvesting before the deep cold came, and she had heard Tobias's voice first, high and concentrated, asking something specific about the position of his hands, and then Cade's voice, lower, patient in a way she had not heard from him before, explaining the balance of it, how you held the reins with feel, not grip, how you learned to be still so the horse could move. She stood at the corner of the barn and watched without announcing herself. Tobias sat on the bay horse, which was moving well enough now for this kind of slow, careful work, and Cade walked beside them at an easy pace, one hand near but not touching the bridle, his attention entirely on the boy. He was talking in that same low, patient voice, correcting small things before they became habits, praising sparingly and specifically, the way you praise when you mean it. Tobias was concentrating so hard his tongue had come out slightly at the corner of his mouth. Nora stood there for a few minutes and felt something move through her that she did not immediately name. It was something older and more fundamental, the feeling of watching a thing that has been frozen for a long time begin, tentatively, to thaw. She thought of Colt's letter. She thought of the word he had used, stuck. She thought about how a person got unstuck, and whether it happened all at once or in increments so small you only recognize them in retrospect. She went back to the garden. That evening, Tobias talked about the lesson all through supper with an enthusiasm he had not shown for anything since she had arrived, describing the exact angle of his heel and the way the horse's ears moved, and a specific moment when he had felt, briefly, the thing his father was describing, the balance, the communication of it. Cade ate and listened and corrected one detail and let the rest of it run. And once, when Tobias said something about the horse's personality with particular accuracy, Cade glanced across the table at Nora with an expression that was simply, unguardedly, the expression of a parent who is pleased. She held the look for a moment and then looked back at her plate. The gesture was small. It was the smallest possible thing. But it was the first time he had looked for her face in a moment of feeling something. And she knew what that meant, had seen it enough times to know its weight, the particular significance of turning toward a person without deciding to. He came to find her in the barn 3 evenings later, which was something he had not done before. She was with the bay horse, not from medical necessity anymore, but from the simple pleasure of the animal's company, the uncomplicated warmth of it, the way horses did not require anything from you except honesty of manner. Cade stood in the barn doorway with his coat on and his hat in his hand, which meant he had come specifically, had taken his hat off before entering in the way men did when they were entering a space they wanted to be received in, rather than simply passing through. "I want to ask you something," he said. She turned to face him. "The station you worked at," he said. "The medical one. Why did you leave?" It was the first time he had asked her anything directly personal. She recognized it as what it was, not casual curiosity, but the specific offering of attention, the implicit statement that he was prepared to receive a real answer if she gave one. She leaned against the stall rail and looked at him. "I trusted someone I shouldn't have," she said. "That's the short version." "And the long version?" She was quiet for a moment, deciding not whether to tell him, but how much of it was hers to give right now. "There was a man I worked with," she said. "A doctor. He was good at his work. I thought he was good in other ways too, because I was confusing competence for character, which is an easy mistake to make with people who are impressive at what they do." She paused. "I told him things. About the patients, about what I observed, about my own assessments. He used that information to advance himself, and when it became useful to distance himself from me, he did. And there was nothing I could prove, and no one with reason to take my side." Cade was very still, listening. "So I left," she said, "because staying would have meant watching myself become smaller and smaller, trying to survive in a space that had already decided what I was worth." She looked at the horse. "I'm not good at being small." "No," he said, "you're not." And something in his voice made it clear he was not criticizing this. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses and the cold air coming in through the gaps in the boards, and outside the first stars were beginning to show in the darkening sky. She looked at him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and thought about what it cost a person to ask a real question, the specific vulnerability of genuine curiosity. How much easier it was to stay behind the wall of practical talk and daily management. "The person who did that to you," he said, "he was wrong about you." She looked at him. "Not just wrong in how he treated you," he said. "Wrong about what you were worth." He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, without softening. Just the plain statement of something he had assessed and found to be true. "I don't know you well enough to say most things with certainty, but I know that much." She did not respond immediately. She let the words settle where they landed, which was somewhere specific, somewhere that had been quiet and unaddressed for a long time. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and turned his hat in his hands. "Tobias slept well last night," he said. "Better than he has in a while." "I heard," she said. "No lamp in the barn." He looked at her, and she looked back. And neither of them spoke for a moment. And the silence between them had a different quality than it had ever had before. Lighter somehow, as though something had been set down that both of them had been carrying without knowing they were carrying it together. She found the sewing room on a Thursday afternoon, which was not something she had been looking for. The door had been shut since her arrival, and she had treated it the way she treated all closed doors in the house, as belonging to someone else's story, not hers to open without invitation. But the cold had come in hard that week, and she had been trying to locate an extra blanket, and Cade had told her she could look in any of the storage, and she had gone down the hallway trying doors. The room stopped her. It was not large. It had been a working room once, a functional space, and it still held the ghost of that functionality in the shape of things. A shelf of folded fabric along one wall, a small table with a wooden frame that had held something for sewing, a window with good light that faced the hills. But over the top of all of that, layered like sediment, was the evidence of the years since it had stopped being used. A child's jacket on the chair, too small for Tobias now. A pair of gloves, a tin of buttons. Small domestic relics of a person's daily life. The kind of things that accumulated without being collected, that stayed where they were put because no one had been able to decide what to do with them. And on the shelf above the fabric, a single book lying on its side, and next to it a pair of reading glasses that had been folded and set down and never picked up again. Nora stood in the doorway and understood, without anyone telling her, that this had been Reeves' room. She stood there for a moment, not going in, just looking at the ordinary evidence of an ordinary life that had been cut short, and she felt the room's particular sadness, which was not dramatic or overwhelming but was quiet and persistent, the sadness of things waiting in vain for the person who left them behind. She found the blanket she needed on a different shelf and closed the door. That evening, after supper, she told Cade she had opened the wrong door looking for blankets. She told him plainly, without apology, but also without any attempt to make it less than it was. He had gone very still. "I didn't go in," she said. "I just want you to know what I saw, so you know what I know. I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it." He looked at the table for a long moment. "That was her room," he said. "She liked to sew in there. The light was good." "It's a good room," Nora said. "I haven't been able to—" He stopped. He turned the coffee cup. "I kept thinking I'd know when it was time to do something with it. I haven't known." "There's no deadline on that," she said. "Things keep until you're ready." He looked at her, and there was something in his face that lived somewhere between pain and relief. The expression of a person who has been holding something braced against a wall for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. Not that it will go away, but that they can stop holding it quite so hard. "Tobias asked me once," Cade said, "whether we could put one of her things in his room, a book she used to read to him. What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd find it." He paused. "I never did." Nora did not say anything. She watched him sit with what he had just admitted, watched him feel the weight of it without flinching away. And that in itself was different from how he had been in the first weeks. That willingness to stay in the discomfort of something true rather than moving quickly back to the practical and the manageable. "The book is on the shelf in the sewing room," she said, "with her glasses on the left side." He looked at her for a long moment. "You saw it." "I notice things," she said. "I try to use what I notice carefully." He was quiet for a while. The fire settled. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the night was still and cold, and very dark. "Colt was right," he said finally, not looking at her. "About what he was hoping for." She did not ask him what he meant. She knew what he meant. And she knew that saying she knew would be too much, would press on something that was only just beginning to bear weight. And so she did the thing she had learned to do with fragile and important things. She left it space. She picked up the ledger and opened it to the page she had been working on. He stayed at the table, not leaving, not speaking, just present in the same room. And after a while she heard his breathing slow and settle into something easier. And when she glanced up, he was looking at the window with his hands loose in his lap, and his face, for the first time since she had come to this house, not held against anything. She looked back at the ledger. The numbers were beginning to tell a clearer story, and it was not the story Rennick Galt had been counting on. She made a careful note in the margin and moved to the next column and kept working, steady and quiet, while the lamp burned between them and the house held its warmth against the long cold of the night. The notice arrived on a Monday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect. Nora had been in the garden when the rider came through, a young man from town who left an envelope on the porch without dismounting, and was back down the trail before she had crossed the yard. She carried it inside and set it on the table and looked at the name on the front, Cade Harlow, written in a hand too formal and deliberate to be personal, and she left it there for him to find. He came in at midday, which he had been doing more regularly over the past weeks, small adjustments in the shape of his days that had accumulated without announcement. He saw the envelope and picked it up and read it standing at the table, and she watched him from across the kitchen, watched the particular stillness that moved over him, the stillness of a man absorbing impact. He set the letter down. He went back outside. She waited a few minutes and then read it herself, because she had been going through the ledgers long enough to understand that what affected the ranch's finances affected the problem she was already working on, and because she had learned in the past weeks that Cade's first response to difficulty was to go away from it alone, and that he needed that, but that someone still needed to know what the difficulty was. The letter was from Rennick Galt's legal representative. It cited the supplementary agreement that Colt had signed, specifically a clause that allowed the creditor to call the full balance due within 30 days if certain conditions were met. The letter argued that those conditions had been met. It requested payment in full of the remaining sum within that window or, failing that, the transfer of the eastern pasture parcel as settlement. 30 days. She read it twice and folded it and put it back on the table and stood looking at the wall for a moment, doing the arithmetic she had already been doing for weeks in the margins of the ledger, running the numbers against this new and harder deadline. The numbers were possible, barely and not without help, and not without Cade agreeing to something he had not yet agreed to. But they were possible. She put on her coat and went to find him. He was at the far fence line, the one along the eastern boundary, doing work that did not need to be done today. Work that was physical and repetitive and required just enough attention to occupy the part of the mind that would otherwise spiral. She recognized this. She had done it herself, in other places, with other kinds of difficult news. She walked out to him and stood a few feet away and let him finish what he was doing before she said anything. He drove the last staple into the post and straightened and looked at her with an expression that was controlled in the way things are controlled when the effort of controlling them is the most visible thing about them. "He's calling the clause," Cade said. "I know, I read it. The clause was supposed to require a material default. We haven't defaulted. He's arguing the delayed entries in the ledger constitute evidence of financial instability," she said. "It's a stretch, but it's written loosely enough that he can make the argument, and if no one contests it, it holds." His voice was flat. He looked at the fence post, at the eastern pasture stretching out beyond it, the land with the water on it, the good water that Galt had wanted since before Colt was sick. "He's been waiting for a gap," he said. "I gave him one." "Colt gave him one," she said, "with the best intentions and not enough information. That's different from what you're saying." He looked at her. "It's the same result." "It's not the same thing." He turned away from her and stood with his hands on the top rail of the fence and looked out over the pasture, and she let him have a moment of it before she spoke again. "I have figures," she said. "I've been running them for the past 3 weeks. There's a way to meet the balance within 30 days if you're willing to liquidate a portion of the spring cattle early and accept a short-term arrangement from a party who is not Galt." He didn't respond immediately. The wind moved through the grass of the eastern pasture in a long, slow wave, and the sky above was that particular shade of autumn gray that carried cold in it, like a promise. "Who?" he said. "There are 2 families in town who have expressed willingness," she said, quietly. "Not because they want something from you, but because they respected Colt, and they don't respect what Galt is doing. I haven't approached them formally. I wanted to tell you first." He turned his head slowly and looked at her. "You've been working on this." "I've been working on the accounts," she said. "This is part of the accounts." "For how long?" "Since I found the ledgers." Something moved through his face. A complicated thing, too layered to read quickly, and she waited for it to settle before she tried to understand what it was. When it settled, what remained was not the anger she had half prepared for, the pride of a man who did not want to be managed. What remained was something quieter and harder to look at. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he said. And it was not quite an accusation, not quite a question. "Because you weren't ready to hear it sooner," she said. "And because I wasn't certain enough of the numbers to bring you a problem without also bringing you a possible way through it." He looked at her for a long time. The fence post was between them, and the eastern pasture behind him, and somewhere far off a hawk called once and went silent. "All right," he said. It was a small thing to say for a large thing to agree to, but she understood that for him it cost something real, the particular cost of a proud man accepting that the ground he has been standing on alone is steadier with someone else on it. She nodded and turned back toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked back across the cold grass together without speaking, which was its own kind of language by now. He told her about Reeve that night. It came out of something small, the way the real things often did. Tobias had asked at supper if they could take flowers to where his mother was buried when spring came. Asked it the way children ask things they have been holding for a while, plainly and without warning. And Cade had said yes, and then gone very quiet for the rest of the meal. And Tobias, sensitive to the frequencies of his father's silences, had gone to bed without being asked. Nora was washing the dishes when she heard Cade come into the kitchen behind her. She did not turn around. She heard him pull out the chair at the table and sit in it heavily, the way a man sits when he has run out of the energy required to hold himself at the usual height. She dried her hands and turned around and sat across from him. He did not look at her right away. He looked at his hands, which were flat on the table in front of him, large hands, rough from years of work, and he looked at them the way a man looks at tools he is not sure he has been using correctly. "We argued that morning," he said. She waited. "Reeve and I. The morning it happened." He said it without looking up, the words coming out carefully, the way you carry something that has been inside a closed space for so long that bringing it into the open air feels dangerous, like exposure could damage it, or you. It wasn't a big argument. That's the part that it wasn't even about anything that mattered. Something about the fence schedule. Something stupid. He paused. She wanted me to put off the far pasture work and spend the day closer to the house. I said I'd be back by midday. I wasn't. He stopped. The fire in the stove spoke for a moment, a dry creak and pop of wood giving way to heat. "The storm came in faster than anyone expected," he said. "By the time I realized how bad it was, I was already 2 miles out and the visibility was going. I started back." He looked at his hands. She came out to meet me. She'd taken the rope line from the barn, the guide rope, and she was following it out toward the pasture Because she knew I didn't know where it was in the whiteout. He swallowed. She found me. She did. She knew exactly how far out I'd be. And she came out there, and she found me. And we made it back. And then the cold had gotten into her. And I didn't see how bad it was until it was... He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. I should have been there, he said. I should have come back when she asked me to. She wasn't asking for no reason. She never asked for no reason. And I said I'd be back by midday, and I wasn't. And the whole thing, all of it, came from that one morning. His voice had not broken. He was not the kind of man whose voice broke easily, but the quality of it had changed, thinned to something that exposed the structure beneath, and it was harder to hear than breaking would have been. Nora sat with it for a moment. She did not reach for him. She did not offer the reflexive consolations that were so easy to give and so useless to receive. She sat with the weight of what he had said and let it be heavy and true without trying to make it lighter. She came out for you, Nora said. He said nothing. In a storm, she said, with a rope line because she knew how to find you. That's not the action of a woman who was angry or frightened or waiting for you to fail. That's a woman who knew her husband and knew he'd need a way home. She paused, choosing the next words with the care she gave to things that mattered. She didn't go out there because of the argument. She went out there because of everything that came before it. All the years of it. He looked up at her. His eyes were dry, but there was something raw in them, something that had been under pressure for a very long time. The argument was not why she died, Nora said. You know that. You've known it. But knowing it and being able to stop holding the other thing are different, and you haven't been able to stop holding it. He looked at her. You can't trade your way out of grief, she said. There's no argument you can win with it. There's no amount of a loan that pays it off. She held his gaze. She went out there to bring you home. That's the truth of her. That's who she was. Carry that instead. The silence that followed was the longest silence there had been between them in all the week since she had come to this house, and it was nothing like the earlier silences, the heavy, accumulating ones that pressed against the walls. This one had a different quality entirely, open rather than closed. The silence of a thing that has been said and received, and is now simply being lived in. Cade put one hand over his face, not to hide. She did not think it was to hide. More the way a person covers their eyes when they are adjusting to a sudden change of light. His shoulders moved once, the barely perceptible movement of a breath taken all the way in, all the way out. The kind of breath that comes at the end of something. When he put his hand down, he did not look embarrassed. He looked tired in the way a person looks tired after something is finally over. The specific exhaustion of release. Tobias keeps her book, he said. The one from the sewing room. I put it in his room last week. I know, she said. He showed me. Something came into his face at that. A warmth she had seen only in pieces before, in moments with the horse and with his son, and it settled there now in a way that did not go away when he looked at her. The next morning, Rennick Galt came himself. He arrived early, before the day's work had properly started, and he came alone this time, which was either confidence or calculation. And with Rennick Galt, those things were difficult to separate. He sat in the kitchen with the ease of a man who has already decided how the conversation ends, who has brought finality with him in his coat pocket, and is simply performing the courtesy of arriving. Cade sat across from him. Nora stood at the counter, and Galt acknowledged her presence with the brief nod he always gave her. The nod that said he was too experienced to be rude and too assured to be genuinely attentive. "I want to resolve this cleanly," Galt said. "That's all I've ever wanted. Colt and I had a long relationship. I don't want his brother to suffer for a piece of paper signed under difficult circumstances." "What kind of resolution?" Cade said. "A fair purchase. The eastern parcel at proper market value, which I'm prepared to have assessed by a neutral party. You'd have enough to clear your debts with something left over." He spread his hands. "The ranch continues without the water pressure of that land, and you have room to breathe." Cade was quiet. Galt glanced toward Nora with the small smile he used when he wanted to be seen as reasonable. "I think even someone new to the situation can see that this is a practical solution," he said. "Sometimes the wisest thing is to let go of the piece that's causing trouble." Nora set down the cup she was holding and turned to face him fully. "The eastern parcel isn't causing trouble," she said. "The eastern parcel has the water source that sustains the entire west grazing rotation. Without it, the ranch's carrying capacity drops by roughly a third within 2 seasons. She kept her voice level and her gaze steady. "Selling it at market value doesn't give room to breathe. It gives room to fail more slowly." Galt looked at her with an expression that had shifted from patronizing to attentive. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He turned back to Cade. "The clause is valid," he said. 30 days, as the letter states. I'm offering you a way through that's better than what happens at the end of 30 days. The clause," Nora said, "requires material default. We will be demonstrating, with documentation, that no material default has occurred. That argument will take longer than 30 days to resolve, and you know it." Galt looked at her. He looked at Cade. He looked at the two of them together, and his expression did something small and involuntary. The expression of a man revising a calculation he had already made once. "You're willing to fight it," he said to Cade. "We're willing to fight it," Cade said. It was the first time he had used that word in reference to the two of them, and it landed in the room with a quiet significance that Galt heard, and that Nora heard, and that all three of them felt settle into the ordinary air of the kitchen and stay there. Galt picked up his hat from the table. He was not a man who showed anger easily, and he did not show it now, but his movements had taken on the precise quality of someone putting away something they had expected to need. "I'll have my man follow up on the documentation," he said. "We'll have it ready," Nora said. He left without ceremony, and the sound of his horse moving out of the yard carried in through the kitchen window. And then there was only the fire and the morning light and the two of them standing in the kitchen they had come to share. Cade looked at her. She looked back at him. The distance between them was ordinary, and not ordinary at all. "We," he said, the same word he had used with Galt. And now he was saying it just to her. "We," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he put on his coat and went out to the day's work, and she turned back to the counter and picked up her cup. And through the window she watched him cross the yard in the thin morning light, his stride carrying something different in it than it had carried before, something that resembled, if not certainty, then at least the willingness to find out. She drank her coffee. She opened the ledger. There was still work to do, and she was, as she had always been, precisely the person to do it. The rumors about the paperwork reached them on a Wednesday. carried into the yard by a woman named Dell Fitch, who ran the dry goods counter in town, and who had never in Nora's experience said anything without meaning to say it. She came in the late afternoon with a basket of thread she claimed to be delivering as a favor, and she sat at the kitchen table and drank her tea with the unhurried ease of a woman who had something specific to communicate and intended to communicate it properly. She told Nora, with the careful indirection of someone conveying information under the cover of conversation, that there was talk in town, that people were saying the woman out at the Harlow ranch had produced paperwork that couldn't be trusted, that Rennick Galt's man had been making rounds, visiting the feed store and the livery and the post office, having the kind of quiet conversations that were designed to plant doubt without leaving fingerprints. Dell Fitch set down her cup when she was finished. "I want you to know I don't put stock in it," she said. "And neither does Arn Whitfield, who told Galt's man directly that he'd seen your figures and they were sound. But I thought you should hear it from someone who means well." After she left, Nora stood in the kitchen for a long moment and looked at the table where the ledger was open to the column she had been working through before the visit. The numbers were the same numbers they had always been. The documentation was the same documentation it had always been. None of that had changed. Only the air around it had changed. The way air changes when someone has moved deliberately through it, disturbing it, leaving the disturbance to spread outward in rings. She closed the ledger and went to find Cade. He was in the barn with the bay horse, doing the kind of end-of-day work that was more habit than necessity, and she told him plainly what Dell Fitch had told her, the same way she told him everything now, without softening the shape of it and without dramatizing it either. He listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and when she finished, he stood for a moment looking at the middle distance with the expression she had come to know as his thinking face, the one he wore when he was working out the geometry of something he did not yet have a response to. "It won't hold," he said. "Anyone who's actually looked at the accounts knows the figures are real." "Anyone who's looked at them," she said, "but most people haven't." He looked at her. She looked back. The implications settled between them without needing to be spoken further, and she watched him take it in and absorb it and arrive at whatever decision he was going to arrive at, because she had learned by now that Cade Harlow did not benefit from being pushed toward conclusions. He arrived at them in his own time, and when he arrived, he stayed. He took his coat off the hook by the barn door without another word and went to saddle the other horse. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride out toward town in the fading afternoon light, and she stood there until he was a dark shape at the far end of the trail and then gone entirely. And then she went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on and sat down and did not open the ledger because there was nothing in it that could help with what was happening now. What was happening now was a different kind of problem entirely. She sat with her tea and looked at the window and thought about the particular vulnerability of a life that is just beginning to reassemble itself. How fragile that reassembly was in its early stages. How easily the wrong word in the wrong ear could set back the slow and necessary work of trust. She had seen it before, in other places, with other people. She knew how it went when someone with resources and patience decided to dismantle a thing not through force, but through erosion. She refilled her cup when it went cold, and she kept sitting, because there was nothing to do right now except wait and be present in the house when he came back. And being present in the house when he came back was, she had come to understand, not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that accumulated day after day into something that mattered. Tobias came down from his room at some point and sat in his chair and read without asking where his father had gone. He had learned, with the quiet adaptability of children who pay close attention, to read the texture of the adults around him and respond to what was actually needed rather than what he might want. What was needed right now was ordinary company and no additional questions. He provided both. When the fire in the stove began to drop, Nora added wood to it. When Tobias's head began to dip toward the book in his lap, she told him it was time for bed, and he went without argument. She stood at the foot of the stairs until she heard him settle, and then she went back to the kitchen and the cooling tea and the sound of the wind finding the gaps in the walls. She heard the horse in the yard an hour after that. He came through the door and took off his hat and set it on the peg and stood in the entry with the look of a man who has done something that cost him and is still in the immediate aftermath of the cost, still feeling where it pressed. "I spoke to people," he said. She waited because the details would come in his time. In the square, before it got too dark. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is now simply carrying it forward. "I don't do that. Stand up and talk in front of people about things that are private. Colt was better at that than me. He could walk into any room and make people listen." He paused and looked at his hands. "I'm not built that way." "What did you say?" she asked. He looked at the table. "That the woman at my ranch was honest. That the figures she'd prepared were accurate, and anyone who wanted to look at them was welcome to come and do so, and I would show them myself. That I had known what Rennick Galt wanted from that piece of land since before Colt was sick, and I had no intention of giving it to him." He was quiet for a moment. "And that my family was not a matter to be decided by other people's opinions." The words settled into the kitchen with a quiet and specific weight. Family. She did not move from where she stood by the stove. "Arn Whitfield stood up before I was finished," Cade said. "Said he'd seen the accounts himself and would put his name to their accuracy. He didn't wait to be asked, just stood up and said it." Something moved across his face, a complicated thing, gratitude, and something harder to name. "Then May Connolly said she'd had dealings with you over Tobias's arm and that you were as straight a person as she'd encountered in a long while. Vern Aldis said something about Galt's man coming around asking questions and what he thought of men who worked that way." He exhaled slowly. "I didn't ask any of them to do that." "No," she said. "They did it because they wanted to. Galt wasn't there himself," he said. "But his man was. I saw him at the edge of the square. He left before I was done talking." She brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from him, and they sat with the tea between them and the last of the evening settling into the house around them. Outside, the wind had dropped and the night was very still, the kind of still that follows a thing that has been uncertain and has now, at least for the moment, been resolved. "It won't be finished tonight," she said. "He'll make another move." "Probably," Cade said. "But he's lost the element he was counting on." He looked at her steadily. "He thought nobody would stand up. He thought I'd been alone long enough that there was nobody left to stand up. He was wrong about that," she said. "He was wrong about a lot of things." He said it quietly and without triumph, the way a person states a fact that has cost something to learn. He didn't know about Whitfield. He didn't know about Connolly or Aldis. He knew the ranch and the land and the debt, and he thought that was everything there was to know. She looked at him. "He didn't know about you," she said. "The version of you that rode into town tonight." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That version hasn't been out much lately." "No," she said, But he showed up when it mattered. Something in his face shifted at that, in the quiet, involuntary way of a man receiving something true. He looked at the table, and then looked at her, and the looking was direct and unguarded in a way that still surprised her occasionally. That the man who had stood at the fence line the morning she arrived, deliberately not turning to face her, was the same man now sitting across from her in the lamplight without anything between them. They heard Tobias on the stairs before they saw him, the sound of a boy who has been awake listening and has decided it is safe to come down. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks with his hair pushed sideways from the pillow and the book from his room still in his hand, as though he had been reading and had simply happened to wander this direction. "Is it fixed?" he asked. "Getting there," Cade said. Tobias came to the table and sat in his chair and picked up the cup of tea Nora had already poured without being asked, because she had learned the sound of his feet on the stairs and she knew by now that he would come. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at his father with the serious directness he brought to everything important. "You went to town," he said. "I did. To talk to people about Nora, among other things." Tobias nodded slowly, processing this. Then he looked at Nora with the same gaze he had given her from the very first morning, the gaze that evaluated without performing evaluation, that saw what it saw and filed it honestly. "He doesn't usually do that," he said. "Go into town and talk to people like that." "I know," she said. "He did it for you." "Tobias," Cade said, with the mild tone of a man who objects on principle but cannot honestly dispute the substance. "I'm just saying what's true," the boy said, with the complete and devastating calm of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by honesty in the presence of adults. Nora looked at Cade. Cade looked at the table. The fire in the stove cracked once, settled, and the kitchen held them all in its small, warm circle of light. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world. 3 people at a table in the evening. And it was not ordinary at all. 3 days later, Rennick Galt's man came to the house. Not Galt himself. The man who came was the same one who had been making rounds in town, compact and careful in his manner. The kind of man who delivered messages for people who preferred not to deliver them directly. He brought a revised letter in a clean envelope, and he handed it to Nora at the door without much in the way of preamble, and rode back down the trail before she had finished reading it. The letter withdrew the 30-day notice. It cited, in the measured language of legal correspondence, a procedural irregularity in the original clause's application and indicated that the matter would require further review before any formal action could proceed. Further review was the language that meant the ground had shifted and the position was no longer tenable, and everyone involved understood it, but no one intended to say so in plain terms. She read it twice and carried it inside and set it on the table and stood looking at it for a moment with the particular feeling of a thing that has been braced against and has not, after all, arrived. Not relief exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter than either. The simple registering of a door that has stayed closed. She put the letter in the back of the ledger with the rest of the documentation where it belonged, and she went out to the garden to do the work that the morning had been waiting for. Cade found her there an hour later. He had read the letter before she left it, she knew, could tell from the way he crossed the yard with a different quality of step than the days before. Lighter at the heel. He stopped a few feet from where she was working and stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the cold rose of the garden. "He'll try something else," she said without looking up. "That land isn't going to stop mattering to him." "No," Cade said, "but he knows now it won't be easy. And men like Galt, don't spend themselves on things that won't be easy when there are other things that will. He paused. He'll look for an easier place to apply the pressure. And not find it, she said. And not find it, he agreed. She straightened and looked at him in the pale winter light and thought, not for the first time, about the distance they had traveled from the morning she stepped off that wagon and he had not turned around. The distance was not measured in weeks, exactly. It was measured in the accumulated weight of ordinary moments, the suppers and the silences and the ledger entries and the late nights by the stove, the morning with the horse's leg and the evening he had told her about Reeve and the afternoon she had watched him teach his son to ride. All of it adding up, the way all the unremarkable days of a life add up to something that turns out, in retrospect, to have been essential. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. He had the look he wore when he was going to say something true at personal cost. The gravity of a man who has decided the cost is worth paying and is simply making sure before he pays it. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. Not because of the arrangement Colt made. Not because the situation here needed someone and you were the one who came. "I want to know if you want to stay. For your own reasons. Whatever they are." She looked at him for a moment in the winter light. This quiet and difficult man who had been alone for a long time in the middle of all this open space, who had slowly, across the weeks since she arrived, begun to remember how to let someone else carry part of the weight, who had stood in a town square when he found it hard to stand in town squares, who had found a book for his son, who had sat in the kitchen in the late night hours and let something go that had been locked in him for years, and had been, afterward, visibly lighter. "I knew I wanted to stay from the night I saw you standing in the yard at 4 a.m, she said. "I just needed you to be ready to ask." Something in his face opened, quietly and without drama, the way a window opens in a room that has been closed too long. Not a breaking of anything but a release of pressure, the slow and necessary letting in of air. He crossed the space between them, and she did not step back, and when he put his hand against her face, it was with the same deliberate care he brought to everything that mattered to him, unhurried and certain. She put her hand over his and held it there, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, because nothing else was needed. When he finally said her name, just her given name and nothing around it, it landed differently than it ever had before. It sounded like something he was keeping, like something he had decided, without announcement, to keep for a long time. Spring came the way it always came to that country, slowly at first and then with sudden conviction, the frost retreating by degrees, until one morning the grass at the edge of the yard was green and the air carried mud and growth and the bright particular quality of light that belongs only to the season arriving after a long cold. The garden went back in over 3 days in early spring, Nora on her knees in the turned earth, and Tobias beside her, moving with the absorbed concentration of a child who has been given a real task and takes it seriously. Cade worked the far fence in the mornings and came in for the midday meal without being reminded, which was not something she took for granted, which was something she noticed every time with the same small private acknowledgement of what it meant. The ledger had been balanced and documented and filed, and the eastern pasture remained as it had always been, the good water moving through it, the grass coming back green in the warming days. Rennick Galt had not appeared again, and no further letters had arrived. The silence from that direction was not necessarily permanent, but it was real, and real silence was something. Arn Whitfield had come by in the early weeks of spring to look at the accounts himself, as he had offered in the town square, and had gone away satisfied and said so to anyone who asked. May Connolly had sent a basket of preserves with a note that required no interpretation. Small things, the kind that did not announce themselves as the restoration of anything but that were, in their accumulation, exactly that. One morning in the full warmth of mid-spring, Tobias came running from the barn before breakfast, calling for Nora with the specific urgency of a child who has discovered something important and cannot wait for ordinary communication channels. She followed him across the yard in the morning air and through the barn door, and into the dimness and the smell of hay. And there in the corner stall, still finding her legs, pale gold and blinking against the lamplight, was the bay horse's foal, born in the night. Tobias dropped to a crouch beside her immediately, speaking in the low, soft voice his father had taught him, the voice that horses trusted. Nora stood in the entrance to the stall and watched him and felt the fullness of the moment in the way that certain moments are felt, not loudly, but completely. The sense of being present for something that will matter for a long time. She thought about Cade Harlow's letter and the last line of it, the line she had read in the barn on the morning she finally took it out of the box. She thought about how a person could be right about something they would never get to see. Cade came in behind her. She felt the warmth of him close, and he looked over her shoulder at his son and the new foal, and she heard the change in his breathing that meant he was moved and was not entirely sure what to do with it, which was still sometimes the case, which she expected would be the case for a long time, and which she did not mind at all. She needs a name, Tobias said, looking up with the seriousness of someone who understands the weight of naming. She's yours to name, Cade said. Tobias looked at the foal. He looked at Nora. He looked back at the foal with great deliberation. Colt, he said. For Uncle Colt. Is that all right? The word went through Cade in a way Nora felt without seeing. A stillness, and then a breath, and then a settling. That's exactly right, he said. His voice was even and quiet and carried everything underneath it. They stood there together for a while, the three of them in the warm barn with the morning coming in through the gaps in the boards, the new foal finding her legs with the tentative determination of something discovering what it is capable of. Later, when Tobias had gone in to wash up for breakfast, Nora went to the shelf near the stall and opened the wooden box. She did not need the tools this morning. She reached past them and found the envelope at the bottom and took out Cade Harlow's letter and read the last line one more time in the new light. I am sorry I won't be there to see how it turns out. I think it turns out well. She folded it carefully and held it for a moment. Then she put it back in the envelope and set it at the bottom of the box again and closed the latch. She could have put it somewhere more permanent. She could have found a drawer for it or a shelf in the house. But she left it in the box because the box was where she kept the things she used in the actual work of her days, and the letter belonged there now, among those things, because it was not a relic, and it was not a keepsake. It was simply part of the story she was still inside of, and she saw no reason to file it away before the story was done. She picked up the box and carried it back across the yard in the spring morning, and the door of the house was standing open, and from inside came the sound of Tobias's voice and the smell of the coffee she had started before she came out, and the ordinary noise of a household moving into its day. Cade was already at the table. She could see him through the door, his hand around his cup, looking toward the window in the particular way he had of looking at things now, open rather than closed, present rather than simply enduring. She went up the porch steps and through the door and set the box on its shelf and poured her own coffee and sat down at the table. Tobias was talking about the foal, about the exact color of her coat, and the way she had looked at him when he spoke to her, and Cade was listening with the full attention he had learned to give again, the kind that did not wander, that stayed where it was put. The morning light came in through the kitchen window and lay across the table in a long, warm stripe, and the coffee was strong, and the fire in the stove had settled into a steady and reliable heat, and outside the spring was moving through the grass of the eastern pasture in long green waves all the way to the hills. Nora held her cup and looked at the window and felt, without trying to name it too precisely, the thing she had come looking for without knowing its shape. She had found it here, in the ordinary and unremarkable and entirely sufficient fact of this morning and the people in it, and in the reasonable expectation of the morning after that, and the one after that, stretching forward into a future that belonged to all of them now, that had been built out of the same material as everything worth keeping: time and honesty and the willingness to stay. The sewing room had been opened in early spring, on a morning when the light through that particular window was the best it would be all year, clear and warm and coming in at an angle that made everything in the room look considered, deliberate, chosen. Cade had opened it himself, without saying anything to Nora in advance, and she had come upon him in the doorway with a cloth and a bucket of water, beginning the work of cleaning it out properly. She had stood behind him for a moment, seeing the room over his shoulder. He had felt her there and turned, and she had met his eyes, and neither of them had said anything. And then she had gone to get a second cloth, and they had cleaned the room together, working in the easy parallel quiet of people who had been working alongside each other long enough that coordination did not require communication. They had moved Reeves' things carefully, the fabric to a chest where it would keep, the sewing tools to a box Tobias could look through when he was older and wanted to understand who his mother had been, the reading glasses and the book to the table beside Tobias's bed where they had always belonged. They had washed the window and swept the floor and put clean curtains up, curtains Nora had sewn from a length of fabric she had found in the chest, pale and simple, the kind that would let the good light in. The room was still Reeves' room. It always would be, the way a place belongs to the person who filled it with their living. But it was also, now, a room that was used, that had air in it, that did not sit shut against the rest of the house in a kind of suspended grief. Nora kept her medical box on the table there when she was not working with it. She had started keeping a small journal there in the evenings, nothing consequential, just the daily accounting of what had happened. The small record of things noticed and things done and things still to come. Tobias liked to sit in the chair by the window after his lessons and read, which was where he had always wanted to sit, and the light in the room in the afternoon was exactly as good as it had been when Reeve was alive. Some things kept,